Prime Minister Brown, welcome back to the programme.
A pleasure.
So you were in office both as Chancellor, then as Prime Minister, during the years where the Taliban were defeated, Al-Qaeda was defeated, and it seemed the whole point was to free Afghan women and to create some kind of stable political environment. When you see what's happening now to the women, what do you think?
And millions of girls and women went to school for the first time. There was a huge expansion of rights and opportunities for girls and women. And to see what is happening now, the exclusion of girls from education, women from employment, the ban on entry into public places, most recently a ban on even entry to cemeteries where relatives are buried, that is afflicted on women and on girls, is the most heinous and vicious crime that is being perpetrated against women and girls around the world. And I'm surprised there is so little international attention on this flagrant abuse of human rights, which is systematic, which will continue as long as pressure is not put on the Taliban regime and needs to be dealt with. And that's why I'm proposing that the International Criminal Court look specifically at the violation of the rights of girls and women in Afghanistan. And I believe that governments like the American government and the UK government must impose sanctions on those people who are directly responsible for this policy. It's not enough now just to complain about what's happening. We need a systematic plan to be able to force the hand of the Taliban regime so that girls' and women's rights are upheld and returned to them as they were being returned in the 20 years before the Taliban took control again.
So let me just go deeply into what the UN has said, and this is now 2 years since the Taliban has been in power. Obviously, the plight of women in Afghanistan, they say, is the worst globally. In June, they say women and girls in Afghanistan are experiencing severe discrimination that may amount to gender persecution, a crime against humanity, and be characterized as gender apartheid, as the de facto authorities appear to be governing by systematic discrimination with the intention to subject women and girls to total domination. This is very strong language for the UN, which is not often known for its very strong language. Now, obviously, the United Nations does not recognize the Taliban. How do you call for sanctions, you call for accountability, but they've proven, resistant to that in the last 2 years?
What we have, I think, is a split within the Afghanistan authorities. It's clear that this is being directed by the religious authorities in Kandahar, and it's clear that the minute that there is an attempt to bring education back to girls and women in Afghanistan, the religious clerics, the mullahs, step up their campaign. So increasingly they've banned the entry of women and girls into public spaces, public parks, into any forms of entertainment, beauty parlours, everything that they can really target, they're trying to ban. But there is a split in the regime. It's absolutely clear that within the Ministry of Education, there are people who want to restore the rights to girls. It's also clear that in some provinces, the implementation of this is not happening in the way that the clerics have intended. We know, of course, that there are underground schools that many organizations, NGOs are supporting. We know that internet education is getting through into Afghanistan. We've got to step up all these things to make sure that the Afghans know that they can try and repress for some time, but they will never be able to repress forever, that they can ban books and ban education, but the world will get through. And I think it's very important to recognize that there are very brave young Afghan girls and women who are fighting at the risk of torture and the risk of being imprisoned for the rights of girls to go to school. And of course, the most prominent leader of the NGO in Afghanistan that is pressing for women's education and girls' education is now in prison. We need to alert the world to what is happening. And of course, I think we need to expose this split within the Afghan regime.
So that is a very interesting thing that you put your finger on, because my reporting has revealed that as well. But here's the thing. As you say, the more practical, pragmatic-minded Taliban, who actually control the most militia and are the most powerful, they're in Kabul, but they seem not to want, on pain of death and sanctions and everything else, they seem not to want to challenge the religious authorities, the fundamentalists in Kandahar. So what would you prescribe for some kind of way of changing the fundamentalist religious authorities?
That's why, in addition to the legal opinion we're publishing in the next few days, and in addition to asking individual governments to put sanctions on the regime, I think it's very important for the Muslim majority countries, the leaders of these countries, to form a delegation to meet the religious clerics in Kandahar. Everybody, I think, who studies this knows that there is nothing in Islam that says that girls' education should be banned or suppressed. There's nothing in the religious edicts of the religion that should allow for this discrimination to happen. And you're right to say, as I say in the opinion that we do, that this is gender persecution. It is gender apartheid. And that's why it is something that we've got to fight in Afghanistan to prevent it happening in every other part of the world. So I would appeal to the Muslim majority countries' leaders who have expressed distaste for the policy, who have called on it to be changed, but to go further and lead delegations into Afghanistan to the clerics and not just to the political leaders, and to tell them that this is not only anti-Islam, but it's an offence against basic human rights that we cannot ever uphold. And at the same time, we are not going to allow other countries to face this in the future, so it cannot succeed in Afghanistan. We have had meetings. The Taliban have a number of committees in the government looking at these issues. But you're right to say that the ban by the religious clerics has got to be taken head on. And religious clerics from the rest of the world, as well as political leaders, should be putting pressure on these Kandahar mullahs who are standing in the way of girls getting the proper rights to education.
So you're the UN Global Education Envoy, and as you've mentioned, there is a split. So you're recommending the ICC levels charges of crimes against humanity. Is that a blanket allegation to all the Taliban? Does it name particular? How will it work, and what will be the result, do you think?
I think you know the way the International Criminal Court works, and it's doing an investigation generally into Afghanistan at the moment. But the way it works is that charges are going to be laid against individuals for their decisions and for their part in the crimes against humanity. Gender persecution, I think, is now recognized as a crime against humanity. And this is the classic case of where it's happening in a way where we've got to act. And so I would urge the International Criminal Court, the prosecutors of the court, to open an investigation specifically into gender discrimination, either that or extend the existing review they're doing into including specifically gender discrimination. And I would want to see a report done on this. Now, there's a precedent in the last few months because the ICC has taken action against Russia by opening the investigation and laying charges in relation to the transfer of children from Ukraine to Russia. And so for the first time, in a way, the International Criminal Court is dealing with the needs of children in a way that we've been arguing for some years. But to extend the investigation in Afghanistan into specifically the crime of gender discrimination, under the aegis, of course, a crime against humanity, would be the right thing to do next. Now, of course, the International Criminal Court is independent, and it's right that it be so. But I think governments should say that they will support the prosecutor if he is in a position and decides to launch this investigation and to lay charges against the leaders. That would be the ministers for education, but it could also be the clerics, of course. But it would be those people who have made the fundamental decision to deprive girls of education. Of course, women of employment.
Okay.
Women banned only a few weeks ago from doing medical exams at university. Women banned from going into public places, with other edicts only a few weeks ago. And this systematic abuse of women's rights continues and seems to be stepped up by some of the clerics. And we've got to show that we are not going to take this.
One of the only recourses a lot of women think they have is to flee. And there are many reasons why there is a global refugee crisis and why the tragedies are innumerable. You've got yet another boat that's capsized, killing dozens of people, this time off Italy. Before that, it was off Greece recently. And you have your own country putting asylum seekers and refugees and quote-unquote small boat riders onto what is being described as unsanitary and unsafe boat, fit for 200 people, 500 people are being crammed onto it. What is your view of that policy here?
Well, let's be clear. I do not support the boats policy that is being prescribed at the moment. But let me look at what that means for Afghan girls and women. There are means by which a fast-track asylum-seeking offer can be made to Afghan girls and women. There are two particular fast-track schemes for refugees or asylum seekers to come to our country. And yes, you're right, the present policy is something that I do not support, but there are ways that we can help Afghan girls and women at the moment either get education within Afghanistan, leave Afghanistan to a neighbouring country with some support, or at the same time, if it becomes necessary, and that is what is required, there are two schemes to help people get into this country without the usual problems.
Another obviously huge driver of refugees, plus the whole existential crisis that the whole world faces, is climate change. And we've seen this really chaotic summer of massive, overwhelming heat and then huge fluctuations in temperature and storms. It's really obvious now to even the most reluctant believer. But here in the UK, both the current government and indeed the opposition appear to be diluting their commitment to climate mitigation. Can you tell me why you think that's happening? It's obviously for votes. And how can we get governments to actually step up instead of retreating?
Well, I'm not diminishing my commitment to climate adaptation and mitigation. And I think as chairman of Education Cannot Wait, which is the organisation that helps displaced and refugee children, I think you'll know from your reporting that it used to be the case that most children who were displaced and refugees were because of conflict, and that is still a huge issue in perhaps 40 conflicts around the world. But the bigger number now is climate change, either through droughts or through floods or through fires or through the melting of ice caps and so on and so forth. We are seeing people dispersed across different continents and displaced as a result of that and unable to get education and schooling. So the first thing I think we've got to do is finance the help that we make available to the displaced and refugee, particularly children, to enable them to have a possible start in life that is being denied at the moment. But I also agree with you that COP28 is going to be an important event because it is a test of whether, after all the talk and after all the promises and after all the aspirations that have been set out on paper, which many have thought have just been greenwashing, the world and the international community is going to be able to come up with the funds that are necessary to allow for mitigation and adaptation to take place, particularly in the poorest countries of the world. As you know, we have never met as an international community the 100 billion that has been promised to deal with mitigation and adaptation for the vulnerable countries. The Loss and Damage Fund has hardly any contributors to it, even though it was set up at the last COP in Egypt. And we will have to come up, and I think the oil economies of the Middle East have a particular responsibility here because the COP28 is in Dubai, it's in UAE, a particular responsibility to bring people together with an offer that is a financial one based on the money that they have had as windfall profits from oil and gas, as well as the responsibilities that historic and current emitters have to deal with this problem.
Okay, so just finally then, you were well known for drawing the global coalition together to, come out of the financial crisis. What is it that prevents that happening again in a global way around climate? Why isn't there a commitment by all the countries, not just the poor, not just the rich giving to the poor, but everybody who needs to come together on climate?
It's a retreat worldwide into protectionism, into nationalism and into mercantilism. And that has been a feature of the recent years. In the decade after 2010, we started by having bans on imports and bans on immigration and everything else. Now we have a more aggressive policy pursued by many, many countries that is essentially protectionist and nationalist. And what I'd be looking for at COP28, but you've got the G20 coming in India in September beforehand, the IMF and World Bank meetings, which are a chance to prepare the ground. What I'd be looking for is a new multilateralism. I'd like to see countries recognizing that there are common challenges, and that's what we persuaded people to do in 2009. It wasn't just an American crisis of banking failures, it was a global crisis of financial instability. And to persuade people that because you have a global crisis and a global problem, you need to come together to agree coordinated global solutions. And it's this desire to come together that's got to be fostered over the next few months, instead of countries retreating into the silos, doing their own thing and then blaming other people for not doing enough. We need to have a common aspiration to get to some agreement on what needs to be done financially on climate change, but to deal with financial instability, to deal with the potential of another pandemic, to deal with all the problems that arise from the proliferation of nuclear weapons at the moment. I think all these problems need a common grounding through countries being prepared to adopt a new kind of multilateralism.
On that note, Prime Minister Brown, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you, Christine.